love the second Sunday of Easter. Every year, right after Easter, we tell this same story about Thomas, and it's one of my favorites. Of all the people who witnessed the resurrection of Christ, I think Thomas has the most relatable reaction to it. Of course, this story is ridiculous. Of course, he doubts what he's hearing. I would have demanded to see proof of it myself, wouldn't you? And as I said in the children's messages, Jesus doesn't judge or condemn Thomas for his skepticism. He appears a week later and reaches out his hands in compassion. It's this gesture of vulnerability where Jesus exposes his woundedness. And Jesus says to Thomas, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those," I would say lucky are those, "who have not seen and yet believe." To me, this is like Jesus saying, it is hard to believe without seeing. I get it. So if you need to see, if you need to touch, have at it. And I think Jesus is still reaching out with his wounded hands to all of us who have questions and doubts. There are some of you out there who believe this story of Jesus because another person told you it's true, and you trust their opinion. Maybe you grew up in the church, maybe you had parents who had taught it to you, and if they say something, well, that's good enough for you to trust it. Well, if that's the case for you, great. Blessed are you, ain't you lucky? But for most of us, for me, that's just not enough. If there's a God out there who cares for me, who wants to know me personally, then I'm not about to take another person's word for it. I want to experience that myself. I want to see the wounds and I want to touch the hands. And you know what? I think those are reasonable expectations. You're not asking too much. Becoming a follower of Jesus Christ is a major decision, and I don't think you should base that off of what someone else says is true. You need to experience Christ for yourself. When I talk to people about faith, about why they believe, about why Jesus is important to them, it always comes down to this personal experiences. Times when they saw and touched and cried out for themselves, "My Lord and my God." The details of their theology don't really matter. It doesn't matter if they're conservative or liberal, traditional or progressive, straight or gay. For those who have the deepest faith, it always seems to come down to personal encounters. A moment or multiple moments when they witness the divine, when they feel the Spirit, when they are at a mystical oneness with creation. Our faith starts with touching the hands of Christ. And from there we develop our theologies, our various theories about religion. Faith starts with experience, not with theology. So I'm never interested in arguing with someone about Jesus. You can't convince them that God exists. There's no rational argument for that. That's a waste of time. Instead, faith is an invitation that says, hey, there's this divine presence I've experienced. Something that knows your struggles and cares about your well-being. I know it's hard to believe, but this God thing, this God being reaches out to you, loves you, wants to connect with you. And if you want to experience that, all you need to do is ask. Then let the Spirit take it from there. It's never your job to try to convert another person or make them believe something. That's not what Jesus asks us to do. We are just the hands of Christ, reaching out in vulnerability, saying, hey, here's God. Touch and see. Because it is in you that Christ reaches out now. In your baptism, you died to yourself and Christ was raised in you. We are not our own, we belong to Christ. And so it's going to be through you that the Spirit of Christ will appear to others. It's when you are open, when you are vulnerable, when you show your wounds, that's when people see the divine within you. You don't need to argue about Jesus with them. You simply need to be Jesus with them. But that means you need to be vulnerable and open about your faith. You need to be vulnerable and open about your life. Vulnerable and open about all the questions and doubts you still have. Just like Thomas was. If the story about Thomas doubting had made it into the Gospel of John, it wasn't without Thomas's consent. It got included because this is a story Thomas couldn't shut up about. I pictured Thomas nudging John and saying, hey, did you write down that bit about me not believing? Make sure that's in there. And the only reason we have these apocryphal stories about Thomas refusing to go to India would be because Thomas kept telling these stories everywhere he went. It's not a story that makes Thomas look good. He should have kept it to himself. It's a story that makes him vulnerable and shows his wounds. But it's precisely that woundedness which makes it a powerful story. It's why he was so successful as an evangelist later in life. So in that spirit of openness and vulnerability, I would like to end with a personal story. It's not a fancy story, there's nothing special about it, but it is my story, and I hope that in its woundedness, you might see Christ reaching out to you. If you belong to St. Andrew's or you know me, then you've probably heard this story before, so my apologies for repeating it. There's someone out there who hasn't heard it, and it might be just what they need right now. So I give it for them. It's not a secret that I'm a gay minister in a denomination that isn't yet affirming of LGBTQ clergy. It has its struggles, and the deepest wounds I've received have been from religious authorities, and some people wonder why I stay in the church and why I stay Christian. Let me tell you why. Growing up, I believed what I was told about God. That God was this great and mighty king, a judge and ruler over creation. I believed it all, with one exception. They told me that God was love, but that didn't make sense to me. You see, they also told me that if you were gay, you were going to hell, and that didn't sound very loving. I could believe in a God that was a king to be feared and obeyed, but not a friend who cared about me. I went to seminary with that same attitude, willing to obey God, but out of fear, not out of love. And it was in my first year of seminary that I encountered a faith that wasn't afraid of questions, that invited me to lean into my own doubts and uncertainties. That first year just tore apart all the scaffolding I had built around my faith, and it let me free fall, which is a terrifying experience. But it was only in falling that God was able to catch me. In that first year, I pulled out every text I could about sexuality, and I came to learn that there were a variety of opinions about what the Bible said, and people of sincere and genuine faith believed it was okay to be gay. I wasn't sure if I trusted that or not, but I did begin to wonder. To cut a long story short, by the end of that first year, I had enough doubts and questions within me that I began to wonder, what if God did want me to go on a date with a boy? What if that was okay? Soon after, I met someone and I went on my first date and I had my first kiss. And in that moment, I fell in love. Not just with the boy, but more importantly, with God. I realized then that God really did care about me, that God wanted my joy, that God was waiting to give me life in all its fullness. Suddenly, everything they said about God became true for me. God was love, God was forgiving, God was full of grace and mercy and compassion and joy. I didn't need to feel afraid because I really knew in that moment that God loved me. I thought I had believed in God, but before that moment, I didn't know who God was. It wasn't until I accepted my sexuality that my spirit was free and I was born again. This is the foundation of my faith. It's why I stay a Christian through good times and bad. It's the moment when Christ had reached out to me and took me by the hand. I believe Christ is reaching out to you too. If you've watched me ramble on this long in the video, there's a reason for it. There is a longing in your heart to encounter God, to know for yourself that Christ is real. You have your doubts, I'm sure, but part of you really wishes to know the truth, to experience it for yourself, to feel Christ's hands to touch the wounds in his side. And just like Christ appeared to Thomas, I believe Christ is willing to appear to you too. It won't look the same for each of us. It won't look the same as it did for me. It won't look the same as it did for Thomas. It's different. But if you're willing to be open and vulnerable, I believe that Jesus will appear in your life. Even in this time of quarantine, even when you're locked in your houses, wherever you are, Christ can appear reaching out with compassion and love. And it will be in that moment that you cry out like all the disciples before us, "My Lord and my God." That is my prayer for you. Amen.